I really can't remember the last time I ever did anything like this, but considering that I have been stuck home alone for the past 48 hours, and I'm still going to be stuck here by myself for probably the next day or so, I may as well spend the time doing something that I used to do a long, long time ago, right? Surely? So let's just get on with it. Hey there, everyone. This is, well, it's going to be a pair of hands disembodied. Well, what did you expect from someone as incapable of speaking as I am? The last time I did any video kind of like this is probably when I was still stuck in university in my first year. So that would be like 2009, 2010. Back then, I didn't have any idea what I was doing, and it's quite clear that today, with me sitting here at a table with phones stood on 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thick freaking books just to get the camera high enough to actually get a passable, usable angle for this kind of video. But I still have no idea what I'm doing. But enough of me complaining about how inept I am at this, especially in modern day. I have something to talk about to pass the time, so let's just get straight into that. So in this video, I want to talk about gaming handhelds, and more specifically, the broad range that I would like to classify as emulation boxes. These things have been around for a long time, but probably much longer than you actually think they have been. And if you want to get technical about it, people have been turning contemporary handhelds like the Nintendo DS and the Sony PlayStation Portable into emulation boxes while they were still in production. But it's only really been within the past 5 years or so that they've really started to come into their own. I don't exactly know why they've started to become more mainstream, but you can tell that they have whenever you walk into a branch of like CEX or cash converters and the like, and you see the shelves absolutely littered with things like Steam Decks and the other big handhelds, but also the Chinese machines that have started showing up within the past few years. As for myself, I had my attention drawn to the current generation, or rather the previous generation of emulation boxes by a certain channel. You've probably heard of him. His name is Taki Udon, and he single-handedly lured me into making very questionable purchases over the years. And in more recent times, as a result of him not making a video in almost a year at this point, I've been observing other channels and broadening my knowledge of the machines as a whole. Primarily, I'd say that the most viewed channel that I've been paying attention to is Russ of Retro Game Core, but to a lesser extent, you have channels like Aidan Walls and Joey's Retro Handhelds, as much as he's a bit peculiar about his well, I won't say any more than that. He's a good lad, but he's a bit emotional. Even he admits that. And there are certainly way more other channels out there, like say TechDweeb and the like, but I don't really watch them regularly, like at all. It's just as the YouTube algorithm works, which it works in mysterious ways, as you can probably already know. But I've actually been tinkering with these devices for longer than the YouTube scene has arguably existed. And it all started with this thing. Do you recognize this? It's called the OpenPandora, and it was released all the way back in 2010, almost 15 years ago at this point. And for this time, this machine was absolutely ridiculous. It was a full Linux-based handheld with a full set of working controls. Those don't click. A full keyboard, and it even has, if I can find it, a stylus, because this is a touchscreen. And as for what this thing could actually do, it could run pretty much the entirety of what I would consider to be the typical retro game catalogue, which is basically everything up to PlayStation 1, but not including Nintendo 64, because, well, N64 is a pain in the arse in general. Like, even for modern machines, it's never clear-cut as to whether something is actually going to work or not. And this machine could actually emulate quite a lot of things to almost perfect degrees. You have, as you see here, it's capable of running GT2 quite well, considering that this thing is really, really old at this point. And it runs it better than a certain number of other devices that I have access to, still to this day. And I also took this with me to a trip to Ireland for a few days as part of my birthday back at the time. And one thing that surprised me was just how good this thing's battery was, because I don't remember if I ever charged it during my entire trip there, and it still had plenty of power left by the time it was time for me to get back on the ferry and head back home. But it was far from what I would consider to be perfect. I mean, just looking at the thing, you can see that the biggest issue that the Pandora had was the fact that it really wasn't built all that well. It really does look like a hobbyist machine. These analog sliders here, for instance, they feel incredibly cheap, and to the point where I don't trust them to survive heavy use at all. In addition to the bad sliders here, you have the shoulder buttons, which there are only 2 of them, and these things kept getting stuck on the shell. I remember this many years ago, and it made pretty much any game that required you to use them to be an absolute pain in the arse when the controls would just keep getting stuck. And unfortunately, the test of time hasn't treated this thing as well as I would have liked. The audio is controlled by a wheel on the bottom right there, and as a fully mechanical audio control, it has not lasted well at all. You have to fumble with it a lot in order to find a volume setting that actually displays the audio properly out of both speakers without crackling. And also, what in the actual heck is this button layout? You tell me, because I have no idea. And one other random oddity about this device is that for some reason you can't charge it without the device being turned on. If you plug it into a wall and it's turned off, it will just boot up by itself. And if you try and shut it down, it will automatically start itself back up again. But either way, this was the first handheld that I ever owned. And it would pave the way for my future hobby of, well, collecting and tinkering with emulation boxes like this. This really is, in hindsight, something that nobody should get into unless they have way too much expendable cash on hand, because it is not a cheap hobby at all. Not only is it expensive, but you also end up falling into a very common pitfall that people have spoken about, where you end up spending more time just tinkering with these devices rather than actually playing the games themselves. But today, as a result of me being stuck at home by myself, I'm going to spend this afternoon talking about my collection of these machines. This might take a while, so you can either bear with me, or if you want to, you can skip ahead using the things that I have hopefully set up to cut to any device that may or may not be catching your eye. So without further ado, let's begin in chronological order. Well, kind of. The GamePad Digital Win 1, or GPD Win, released in 2016. This thing was so powerful at its time that I recall it actually being mentioned in a video from the late John Bain, aka Total Biscuit, and for its time it was absolutely a very capable machine. I remember it having smoothed out curves pretty much everywhere, making it incredibly comfortable to hold. It had a full control set, just like the OpenPandora back there. Its performance was solid, and surprisingly for a Windows-based device, it was incredibly affordable. which is the primary reason why I was able to get it in the first place. And my absolute peak memory of the original Win was when I took it to a gaming expo down at the NEC in Birmingham many years ago. And I was seeing demonstrations for as-to-be-released games of the time, like Sonic Forces, Super Mario Odyssey, and what I believe would ultimately end up being released as Hot Shot Racing many, many years later. And although I never ended up being able to build up the confidence to speak with him as a result of being the socially awkward bastard that I am, I met someone that I came across online years back during the plastic guitar heyday. The absolute legend, world record holding madman himself, now turned sim racer for some inexplicable reason, George Boothby, aka UCOG. Unfortunately, as for the GPD Win itself, mine ended up effectively destroying itself over the course of many, many months through an extreme case of what others would like to call Anbernic engineering, which is funny because at the time of the Win 1's release, Anbernic didn't even exist. The Win was cursed by having a power-on mechanism that was tied to the lid opening, and unfortunately it was incredibly sensitive, and you would find it turning on in your pocket without any rhyme or reason. And it would absolutely be at its worst when you take it around with you, then come back, take it out your pocket and find it's been on for probably the entire time. And as a result of the device having a fan to cool itself, and it probably not being able to work like at all in the confines of a pocket, it would overheat. And because of the Anbernic engineering, the battery was very close to the hottest part of the machine. And as a result of that heat exposure, the battery just ended up killing itself, and it eventually got to the point where it could not hold a charge so much that I couldn't even run it from the mains anymore. I ended up taking the device apart to contemplate replacing the battery, saw that it was absolutely swollen like hell, and took it out of the house as fast as I possibly could. Like, there was no way I was keeping something that swollen inside the house. That would be stupid. And as a public service announcement, although you've probably already heard it at this point, so sometime over the past few years, if you've ever owned a PlayStation Portable and it's been laying in a drawer for God knows how many years, take a look at it and check its battery, because I did, and its battery was also swollen. It had actually swollen so much that the plate covering the battery had pinged clean off, and it no longer is able to actually keep a secure hold of the console at all. At the very least, PSP batteries are easy to replace, but the Win 1, no chance. It was essentially defunct at that point, and by the time there was the potential to get the battery replaced, there were already other devices out there, and unfortunately, none of the devices could hope to have the same level of competitive price tag as the original GPD Win. The Bittboy PocketGo 1, released in 2017. My god, this thing was a piece of crap. It won't even turn on, and I'm pretty sure I charged it last night just for this video. The original PocketGo hails back from a time when these devices were absolutely severely lacking in firepower, to the point where I'm pretty sure this thing couldn't even run the whole Super Nintendo catalogue at the time. The most infamous problem, though, of these early devices was something covered pretty extensively by Taki back in the day, and that was screen tearing, and the screens just being pretty bad in general. This thing's resolution, for example, I believe was so small that you couldn't really play Game Boy Advance games on it without it either looking like an absolutely blurry mess or it being so squinty you'd need binoculars to see anything. However, despite the fact that this thing is severely underpowered, I did actually get quite a bit of mileage out of it back in the day. I would primarily use it to play the likes of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games during car journeys, and it did pretty well at that, but it really didn't get to do much of anything else. And the worst part about it, and the worst part about that is I can't even explain it, show it to you, because I can't turn the damn thing on, is that just by it being powered on, it would emit this constant electronic whine. And it didn't even sound like it was coming from a speaker or anything like that. It was like you could hear the processor working in the background. And it was so loud that it just took you out of the experience completely. And especially when you compare this to the OpenPandora from there, which is a device that was pretty much 7 years older than this really did feel just like a huge step backwards. But at the same time, this was the infancy of got a lot of distractions. But as I was saying, especially compared to the OpenPandora from 2010, 7 years before this thing came out, this felt like such a huge step backwards in terms of what these things could actually do. But at the same time, this was only the beginning of the Chinese putting their foot into the ring. The PlayGo, released 2020. This thing's pretty funny, because I'm not actually sure what the heck it's meant to be. I believe it's meant to be a clone of the Bittboy PocketGo 2, but what I do know for sure is that this thing was my go-to handheld for the best part of 3 years or so. It managed to reach the performance barrier that the OpenPandora was able to achieve about a decade prior. And I played Gran Turismo 2 to absolute death on this machine. And despite the fact that this thing is kind of small by today's standards, that meant it was incredibly pocketable, and I was able to take it with me to pretty much anywhere that I was able to go to at the time. Though at the same time, this was close to the pandemic, so where you were able to go was a bit down to RNG at that point. And although the controls are they haven't stood the test of time too well, you have to press them down quite a bit in order to get a proper response out of them. I do like the control setup of this device, and I do love the fact that it has a dedicated menu button, which is something that not everything does to this day, and whenever it's not there, I absolutely lament its non-existence. Unfortunately, as you can see right here, the top of the slider came off at some point, and I was never able to figure out where the bloody thing went. And God, now I'm looking at it, you can see all of the crap that has managed to get stuck in there over the years. The loss of this didn't bother me too much because I wasn't really using this for anything anyways, but the fact that this broke off would play a pivotal role in many of my later purchasing decisions. Although unfortunately I can't say that it did anything about the next purchase that I'll be talking about, very briefly I might add. The Anbernic RG 350p, released 2020. In theory, this was essentially just a PlayGo, but it had analog sticks on it. But in practice, it was absolutely comical how bad that this PocketGo clone was in comparison to the PlayGo that we just talked about, to the point where it made me very wary of Anbernic for probably 2 or 3 years. Even with the best custom firmwares available for this machine at the time, somehow, despite having the exact same chipset as the PlayGo, it could not run Gran Turismo 2 at full speed. And I'll be making mention of this Gran Turismo 2 tests a number of times over the course of this video because it is kind of an important benchmark for me personally as a result of it being, well, probably my favourite game of all time. If a device can't run that at full speed, at base resolution and all that, then I can't consider it to be a properly good, usable device. Full stop. But on top of the fact that this thing couldn't even run GT2, it was cursed by having absolutely broken audio. Every time you would turn this on or change it to a different application, the speaker would pop, and it would pop so loud that it was impossible to ignore, and it just drives you absolutely freaking bonkers. Needless to say, at the time, this was by far the biggest mistake I had made purchasing any device like this. The Retroid Pocket 2 Plus, released in 2022. This is a curious one for sure, as it was the very first device I bought that was Android based, which is kind of a big deal. And all the way back then, I had absolutely no idea what the hell I was doing with Android. I was basically just relying on RetroArch to do all of the heavy lifting for me. And as it turns out, that is an absolutely terrible idea. Even to this day, there are systems that you do not want to run through RetroArch. The Pocket 2 Plus was actually relatively capable for its time, but at the same time it was only barely above the level of the PlayGo, and essentially I believe I bought it at the time because it had the analog controls that the RG350p had, but unlike the RG350p, the machine actually bloody worked. But by far the biggest thing that I remember about the Retroid Pocket 2 Plus was just how weird the design of the thing was. The proportions were boxy, and the screen was so comically small compared to everything else around it that it just looked absolutely ridiculous to me. And it was also about that time when I started to realise that when it comes to retro handhelds, that having the analog stick on the top compared to the directional pad is not something that I enjoy all that much. And so that would start to shape some of the decisions that I would make later down the line, as well as the fact that it was at that point that I was starting to get worried about taking things with analog sticks with me in my pocket. Ultimately, my Retroid Pocket 2 Plus will be given away to my brother, and unfortunately he had even less idea of what to do with it than I did, and it's probably just rotting away in some shelf somewhere, unfortunately. The Valve Steam Deck and later Steam Deck OLED, released 2022. The original heavy hitter that came in like a wrecking ball and set standards for practically every other big machine that came out ever since. And depending on who you ask, nothing out there has properly managed to eclipse it, even in the entire 3 years that this thing has been out. Oddly though, at least for me, I never used the Steam Deck all that much, despite the fact that I do own the dock. And I also did pre-order the original launch spec Steam Deck. Although this one here is not the original launch spec Steam Deck, it is the Steam Deck OLED. Although I did not buy this brand new, I bought this from a branch of CEX. There's absolutely no denying that this thing's potential to play higher end games is absolutely way, way up there. Even if I'm not exactly playing something right now that's, well, way up there. In fact, it's not even playing any audio for some strange reason. And as you can see, it's got this whole arrangement of controls with these touchpads here with vibration on here, and also 2 buttons on the back that allows you to play pretty much anything you want on this, compatibility permitting, of course. Although you will need to tinker around with it quite a bit in order to get the controls to work with some pretty peculiar, mostly mouse-driven games, mouse and keyboard like. But the biggest problem with the Steam Deck was, by quite some margin, the operating system itself. Because Steam Deck compatibility is, well, it's not good, like, at all. To be fair, it is not a really Steam OS's fault that it can't quite run everything that it wants, but the fact that they just don't make games for Linux specifically for the most part, thanks to the effective monopoly that Windows has on the home computer market. As a result of that, most of the games running on the Steam Deck, I imagine, are just running through Proton, which is essentially some kind of Linux-based Windows emulation. And as a result of that emulation, you have many games which simply won't run, and many of those cases is as a result of the anti-cheat systems, or DRM, God forbid, not working with emulation. So, quite critically, Grand Theft Auto 5 and pretty much every Call of Duty game does not work on the Steam Deck at all. And with GTA 5 in particular, I remember that it did work on the deck for some time, but eventually you had an update to GTA Online's anti-cheat systems, which broke the compatibility with the deck. And I have to imagine that it's this absolutely pitiful compatibility that means that whenever you go to a branch of CEX, cache converters, cache generator, anything like that, that the shelves are absolutely littered with these things. It's kind of tragic in a way. But it's not just the compatibility that's an issue. I mean, just look at the size of this thing. It is absolutely freaking massive, and that heft is so much that Retro Game Core essentially memed this thing being used as a size benchmark for every other device that he does reviews on. But this size also means that it is pretty heavy, and that heft means that despite the fact that it is relatively comfortable device, I can't see myself holding it for extended periods of time without my wrists eventually giving way under duress. But one other main issue with the Steam Deck is the fact that it's playing games via Steam, which means that there's a degree of always online that's curses through nearly the entire device. And even though this thing technically does have an offline mode, I have never trusted Steam's offline mode to actually do anything worth a damn. And when this thing has not been able to connect to the internet, I have struggled to even boot the thing up in the first place. That's how crippling that weakness is. So you can barely take it outside with you, because not only is it freaking massive and absolutely needs a case, but you need an internet connection in order to be able to do much of anything with it. The Retroid Pocket 3 Plus, released in 2023. The RP3 Plus is arguably the biggest mistake of my emulation box career. It's unfortunate because I had the opportunity to potentially back out of the purchase decision, because I bought it in the middle of the Taki video when he was talking about the RP3 Plus. But I bought it, and then he started to get on to talking about the issues with it. And unfortunately, I was not wise enough to think that those issues were too big of a deal, but they absolutely were. The biggest problem I would consider it to be a self-inflicted problem, because it was an Android-based device like the RP2 Plus that I owned previously. But unfortunately, I still had absolutely no idea how the hell to set up Android, so I was once again reliant on RetroArch to carry me. And when it comes to PlayStation Portable, that is an absolutely atrocious idea, and I was not able to get PSP to run properly on that thing at all, despite the fact that I'm pretty sure it's more than capable of doing that. The performance deficit of the RP3 Plus was also felt in my attempts to try and play Android games, like not emulating things like at all on it. And the performance was just not there in order to make things either run or run at a even semi-passable frame rate. But by far, the biggest problem of the RP3 Plus was the start and select buttons. That placement is so goddamn cursed that I have no idea how that even got past testing. It also makes it pretty much impossible to use to set hotkeys, even if, as I've mentioned previously with the PlayGo, that I do prefer my hotkey to be a dedicated button in its own right, and the RP3 Plus kind of didn't have that. Not to mention that the RP3 Plus was essentially the last pocketable device that I bought that had analog sticks. And at that point, I started to tread a path of trying to seek out devices which did not have analog sticks but still had the performance to do what I wanted it to. And as it turns out, that's kind of a pain in the arse in its own right. The Anbernic RG Nano, released 2023. Yeah, this absolute goddamn meme. I bought this for precisely the exact same use case that Taki absolutely refused to use it for in his video on the device, which is to have something on my keyring that I could have with me at all times, no matter how comically impractical it actually might be. Now, as ridiculous as this thing looks, especially holding it like this thing somehow passed the Gran Turismo 2 test, although I don't actually have GT2 loaded on this thing anymore. But As you can see, the controls are so ridiculously cramped that trying to do anything on this is a challenge in and of itself. It is just absolutely so hard to try and do anything you want on this. And I mean, when you consider the fact that these 4 face buttons are so small that you can fit them all onto a space the size of a keyboard key, then you have some idea of just how absurd this device is, and that you really shouldn't be getting something this small unless you are, well, batshit insane like me and just want something that's silly. As a result of these odd controls, it's pretty obvious that I haven't really used this for much of anything over the couple of years that I've owned it. It's essentially existed as a glorified keychain decoration and nothing more. However, it is kind of funny how in Taki's video about the RG Nano, he mentions that he wouldn't use it as a keychain device because of the fact that he was worried about the screen getting scratched. However, as you look around this thing, you can quite clearly see that outside of maybe arguably the buttons, the screen is not really phased badly at all. The Anbernic RG 35XX Plus, released 2023. When I originally picked up the 35XX Plus, I had bought it at the start of me realising finally most of the blueprint for what I wanted in my perfect retro handheld device, which would be something that is pocketable with no analog sticks that could be broken off. And although the XX devices would later go on to have great fame and notoriety and all of that, I had bought my 35XX Plus right at its release. And put it this way, it took quite a while for the XX devices to come into their stride, and at launch, the range of operating systems that it had was dire, to say the least, and unfortunately, this isn't the last time that I'll be ending up talking about this topic. You basically only had 3 options. You had stock, you had Garlic OS, and you had a beta of Bandosera, or was it an alpha, whichever. But regardless, stock, unlike other Anbernic devices that have come out since, and especially the stock OS that runs on the XX devices afterwards, this was absolutely unusable. You had 2 avenues of running games through it, either through the standalone section or through RetroArch. And the RetroArch on my 35XX Plus was suffering from a case of what I like to call RetroArch hating Linux. And that's because pretty much at complete random, its settings would absolutely corrupt the heck out of itself to a point where I could not do anything with it at all. And I believe it got so bad that I ended up having to reflash the entire operating system just to fix it. And unfortunately, that happened multiple times. And to make matters worse, the RetroArch side couldn't even pass the Gran Turismo 2 test, which is absolutely absurd for a device that came out 3 years after the PlayGo. And especially after the RG Nano. The fact that the RG Nano could play GT2 just fine and my 35XX Plus couldn't do it at all was absolutely ridiculous to me. But of course you also had the standalone avenue of running your emulators, and unfortunately that had so much audio lag, like it was almost an entire second, that it may as well have been completely unplayable. But the other operating systems available at the time were not very good either. You had Garlic OS, which I didn't end up testing as a result of me hearing that it could not take full advantage of the device's chipset. And as far as I'm aware, the Garlic OS build for the RG35XX Plus was never updated. Never. And then you had the beta build of Bandosera, which was, to put it bluntly, an absolute catastrophe. It took like upwards of an entire minute to boot up, possibly even longer, which in a handheld pocketable device is absolutely unacceptable. And because it was a beta, that meant that it was never really finished. It never had a working sleep function, and somehow It failed the Gran Turismo 2 test even harder than stock by just not running the game at all. It just immediately crashed straight back to process error. All of this absolute bedlam caused me to shelve my 35XX Plus for several months, until I was eventually made aware of the existence of an OS known as MinUI. And MinUI single-handedly saved that device from being a paperweight for the rest of its life, because it uses the stock OS as a base, but it completely simplifies absolutely everything to the point where its menu system is impossible to break, pretty much. And so there's basically nothing that can go wrong with it. And despite the fact that you couldn't really use MinUI to do everything that the device is capable of pulling off, the fact that it was completely foolproof and almost impossible to break made it an absolutely critical development for the XX device line. As for what happened with my 35XX Plus, I ended up giving it to my one of my brother's relatives. And as it turns out, he quite enjoys the thing. I did end up flashing a different operating system on it known as MUOS, but we'll get to that when we get to that. The ASUS Republic of Gamers Ally X, released 2024. Without a question, this is the single most expensive, riskiest purchase that I have ever made, and it goes to this absolute unit of a machine. I made the call to get this thing to act as kind of like a supplement to the Steam Deck, primarily to cover the games that the Steam Deck couldn't run as a result of the fact that it's running an operating system that most games are not compatible with. And I have absolutely gotten a lot of important mileage out of this machine, and quite importantly, it was able to carry me during a time when my desktop was out of action as a result of its drivers deciding it randomly wanted to stop working, and I effectively lost all my USB ports, and I had to get it to taken to a repair shop the following day to get it to actually do what I wanted it to again. And while that was out of action, this carried me, and it carried so hard. And the fact is that I am not even pushing this at all. If the camera will zoom in properly there, and I'm pretty sure it won't. Yeah, it won't. Sod it. I'm not even pushing it. I'm capping this thing to the 15 watt TDP level, which is not even close to this thing's max performance potential. And I'm doing that so that not only am I not pushing it to the limit and weakening the potential lifespan of the device's chipset, but I'm also making the battery last longer. And that's another thing that this device has over the Steam Deck, in that it has an absolutely chunky battery. That means that in theory, it can go on for much longer than any other device in this performance bracket. And in theory, this would also be the device that I would like to take around with me a lot more, certainly more than the Steam Deck, as a result of that thing being effectively cursed to being an online-only device, even though I am technically playing an online-only game at the moment. But the thing has a very, very significant thing holding it back, or rather making it the dangerous purchase that it is, and that is the price. I'm pretty sure this thing is about at least £800, possibly even £900. And that is an incredibly dangerous purchase to be making on a handheld device that could, without some random day, you end up dropping it and it is just gone. The thought of spending that much money on something that could instantly end up destroying itself in an instant is just, it's scary. Absolutely terrifying. The R35S, released 2023. If you thought the Bittboy PocketGo 1 was a piece of crap, then it's got nothing on this. This, I would classify it as the very first device that I bought purely for purposes of tinkering with it. And I bought it from a second-hand shop, and quite literally a second-hand shop that's a 10-minute walk away from home. And just by looking at this thing, you can see why it was there in the first place. What the hell is this control setup? The D-pad is incredibly stiff. The face buttons have these nasty the way the letters are cut into the buttons is nasty, and combined with the fact that the buttons are so stiff naturally that it hurts to press down on them for extended periods of time. And although you can modify it, like I did, in order to make the buttons less stiff as a result of the fact that for some reason two of the buttons, maybe not those two or maybe those two, but the buttons come in sets of two and they are connected by a strange U-shaped piece of plastic, so they're both molded at the same time, and you can cut that to make the buttons less stiff. But if you do that, then the thing starts to rattle quite a bit. Not to mention that these shoulder buttons are so freaking loud, and these sticks are also, well, theoretically they're not so bad, but this thing does not have anywhere near enough firepower to make it to get to the point where these sticks actually make sense to be there in the first place. But the biggest problem with this device is the operating system situation. Like, you'd expect, so if you'd expect that something is kind of built like a piece of crap, then it's going to have, there's a possibility that it might have a good operating system to save it, but ArcOS just is not that. And the reason why ArcOS is not good with that is because this is one of those devices like the 35XX Plus I talked about earlier, where RetroArch just does not like this at all. I've been able to boot into this game just fine, but if I press function to go into RetroArch and I press any of the buttons there, you can see it's completely freaking balked itself, and now I need to find some way to hard shut down this freaking device. It's absolutely god-awful, and though you can reset the configuration in RetroArch, the fact that this has happened like at all, and it's such a huge pain to do anything in order to fix it, is just, it needs patience, and quite clearly I do not have enough patience for this. The Anbernic RG ARC S and ARC D, released 2023. You remember what I said earlier when I was about to talk about these things mostly in the chronological order in which I bought these things? Well, these were about what this video was meant to be about in the first place. So we're going to get back to them a bit and just put them here on the side. Like so. So for now, we'll move on. The Anbernic RG CubeXX, released 2024. Now, I'm not entirely sure about every other video maker's opinion on this thing, but if you were to ask for my recommendation as to the best cheap horizontal form factor handhelds out there at the moment, it would be this one. You may already be aware of just how many devices there are in the Anbernic RG XX line at this point, and it's only going to be getting bigger from what I've heard, with the release of the 34XXSP sometime very soon, probably within the next month or so. They all share the same Allwinner H700 chipset, which means they all have the exact same level of performance, and so what games you're able to run on them, it doesn't really matter too much as in between the different devices. Well, at least in regards to the performance of a thing. What matters more in that regard is the set of controls that they have, and that varies from device to device. The 35XX Plus, for example, does not have any analog input at all, and that's why I bought it in the first place. Whereas this fella has the full double analog sticks input, and as you can see, everything's working relatively well. Well, as okay as Anbernic sticks go, because you've heard about the how weird these things are. But amongst all of the Anbernic RG XX devices, I feel like this one and the 35XXSP are the most universally praised ones, and this one is just so nice. It's got a crisp 720p 1:1 aspect ratio screen, which makes it very good for pretty much any retro system you throw at it, but terrible for widescreen. But to be honest, this thing's firepower is not really enough to play widescreen systems in the first place, so you don't need to worry about that too much. Maybe when it comes to Portmaster games like, well, you see here with Grand Theft Auto 3, it's running perfectly fine, which is absolutely crazy. Portmaster itself is kind of a special, like, party trick of some of these Linux-based devices. and it lets them run things that you would imagine have no right running on hardware this low powered, especially compared to other devices that are out there. This thing is also incredibly comfortable to hold. Maybe not as much as I thought it was going to be when I got it, but it's got these nice things to hold on to, and it's just, you get a very snug and comfortable grip on it. And the fact that the D-pad's up on top only makes it even better in that regard. Though I still wouldn't really advise pocketing a device like this because of the fact that it has sticks and they can break. But this thing is very small to the point where you can easily throw this in like a coat pocket or something that's got a big hold for items, and you can put it in there and it won't get crushed up against anything, and it should be fine. And if there's any one special thing about the RG CubeXX, is that I would say that this is the single best dedicated Pico 8 device that there is, period. Like, no, as far as I'm aware, there's no other screen device with a 1:1 aspect ratio screen that runs native Pico 8 perfectly. And in summary, I really can't say too much more that has not already been said better by other people, especially as my throat is now starting to croak and I'm not even halfway through the video probably. But if you just want a device to get up off the ground but you don't want to break the bank too much, then this is an easy recommendation. The TrimUI Smart Pro, released 2023. This thing kind of makes me sad in a way. This is the second device that I end up picking from a second-hand store. The cash converters in Southport picked up for about 50 quid. And just like with the R35S, I picked up primarily to tinker with it. Though I do like how this thing ultimately turned out, it's just lacking in a few key important areas, at least for someone like me, and especially compared to the CubeXX we just talked about a moment ago. Now, this thing very much feels like a PSP in shape and form, and all the controls on it are actually pretty decent, although I am not entirely a fan of these cut-in face button shapes, because back at the time when I was tinkering with this, my fingers were in a pretty rough shape and they were aching very easily from almost anything I was doing at that point. And I felt like these things, combined with the fact that the buttons are a bit firm and also small, meant that they were cutting into my thumb and it was hurting. I'm not too sure how true that is today, but it is something that I still feel like I should point out. The one thing that surprised me about this device was just how good the stock OS is, and this one is running Crossmix OS, which is essentially just something that uses the stock OS as a base and it builds on it from there. So, as you can see here, it boots up really fast for a handheld, and that is a great thing to have. And the operating system itself is actually pretty good, although navigating it is kind of a huge pain, especially with the fact that you can't see everything on the top here. It just kind of scrolls through them. I'd rather you just could see all of them, and that would make it so much easier to find what you're looking for, especially things like settings and the like. But the biggest problem for me with the TrimUI Smart Pro has been its performance profile, and also its thermals. The thermals in particular, this thing gets pretty toasty around the back. And the thing that I noticed when testing this thing, making sure everything was working, is that pretty much no matter what I run, it would get warm, and much warmer than pretty much every other device that I've tested brought up to this point. Most of the videos you see on this thing point out that it typically only gets hot when you really try and push it, like pushing PSP and Dreamcast games on it. I was getting it with just freaking Sega Genesis games. And to make matters worse, this has a variable function key, and I've currently got this set up to act as a power save mode. And the reasoning for that was me hoping that using the power save on this would ease the pressure off on the processor enough that it would stop cooking itself, but that hasn't happened. This thing still warms up, and that makes it very sketchy for me to recommend. The other sketchy thing for me to recommend is in regards to this device is the fact that despite the fact that it can actually run Portmaster games, for some inexplicable reason, compatibility of the Portmaster range with this device in particular is really poor, and many games just will not start at all for whatever rhyme or reason. But unlike several other devices that I've talked down throughout the course of this video, I still have mine, and I use it as a device that I keep in the side pocket of my car, and so that I have it on hand to bide me time with whilst waiting for my mother to come out of wherever she's asked me to pick her up from at that particular point in time. It is handy for that, but its performance is just a bit too sketchy. Like, I've pointed out that the thing gets a bit hot, but it's also, its performance is kind of not quite there. Like, I know I've put it in power save mode, but even without putting it in power save mode, it has struggled to handle more demanding things. Like, for example, the amount of shaders that I'm able to use with this is not quite up there with the other machines that I have. Overall, like, this thing is fine. It's not the best, but if you can find this on AliExpress for like 40 quid or something like that, well, I don't even know. Honestly, I don't know how optimistic 40 quid is for something like this, but this is fine. I can't say fairer than that. The Logitech G Cloud, released 2022. Yes, we're going backwards this time, aren't we? Now, I don't have this thing with me, and that's because I bought it knowing very well that by the time I was done with it, I would be passing on to my brother as a gift. And if you've heard anything about the G Cloud and the others I've talked about so far, then you know very well that there was no way I was not buying this thing at full price. It was secondhand, no questions asked. This thing is still retailing in PC World for £330 freaking pounds, which is absolutely farcical for the level of performance it has, and that's not even counting the fact that this thing can absolutely be used as an emulation device, but it's advertised as a cloud streaming gaming device that's not running on the power of the device itself in its own right. The G Cloud would end up being my very first foray into actually properly setting up Android devices as emulation boxes. I know I had the RP2 Plus and the RP3 Plus, and I never was able to do it with that, but with the help of the video from Russ of RGC, I was able to figure out how to set this thing up with a front end, get all the emulators linking up properly, scrape all the box art, and it was all hunky-dory. Aside from the fact that I ultimately decided to settle on Digishow as my preferred front end rather than the Emulation Station Desktop Edition, or ESDE, which I cannot stand that thing, like, at all. And I also can't stand that it's being pushed like as heavily as it is in videos, because it is just a nightmare to set up ESDE. And I've heard that it had problems on the Steam Deck where you would try and run it and the game would end up running in the background, which is absurd. And even though I've ended up setting up RetroDeck on my Steam Deck, which is kind of like a self-installed suite with ESDE, it's still not perfect. Like, my problems with ESDE on Android are quite myriad at this point. It requires way too much effort to set up compared to Digishow. It doesn't have a free scraper, which was kind of a big deal because I end up re-scraping all the art on that, but we'll get to that later. And I end up doing that from scratch and using the screenscraper.fr avenue of scraping. That literally took me several days because of the scraping limit. That's the problem with trying to scrape using that, but with Digishow, for whatever reason, even though it's absolutely far from perfect, you can scrape like the majority of things and it'll work fine, and it'll scrape everything, no limits whatsoever. It's great in that regard. But getting back to ESDE, my other problems with it is that it pretty much does not have any proper touchscreen support. All it has is a virtual pad on the screen, and it looks absolutely goddamn hideous, and it's a joke. And it also doesn't have proper support for displaying your Android games without some additional setup layer on top of that, which is quite frankly not acceptable. And the worst part of that is that because of what you saw earlier with the R35S, with the controls getting completely locked out in RetroArch, I'm eternally afraid that at some point, if I do end up using ESDE, that it will also end up getting locked out of its controls. If you end up setting up ESDE as the home app, then if your controls get locked out and you've disabled the touchscreen controls, you've essentially bricked your entire bloody device. I realise that's likely not going to be the case, like you could potentially save it by plugging in a Bluetooth device or something, but the mere thought of that happening absolutely terrifies me to no end. But my biggest issue with ESDE by far is the fact that the Android build, for whatever reason, is hidden behind a freaking paywall. Like, why would you do that? Like, why? The desktop edition for your desktop computers is not paywalled. Any other version of Emulation Station that you have on other devices is not paywalled. So why is the Android build paywalled? It makes no sense and it infuriates me. I realise I've gone off on a bit of a tangent there, so let's get back to the G Cloud. Once I had ended up setting it up, I end up having a lot of fun figuring out what that thing was actually capable of doing, especially when it comes to GameCube games. It was doing pretty well, even though like the performance of the G Cloud is nowhere near the £330 price tag. It's more like £150, £200, something like that. It played what it could play quite well, and it's also blessed with a pretty damn good and big screen. And not only is it like a big screen and it's very comfortable to hold, but it's also incredibly lightweight and the battery lasts freaking forever. But as I said, I knew that I was giving it to my brother, and so eventually, once I had finished, ended up setting it up and then moving on to other handhelds, that's exactly what I did. And as for my brother's take on it, he's enjoyed it way, way more than I could have possibly imagined. Like, within a few days, he was talking about how he was using it to play through the entirety of Medal of Honor 1 on the PlayStation 1 and reliving his childhood games, and that, to me, is priceless. The Anbernic RG 40X XB, released 2024. For what was meant to be the secondary purchase on a strange day when I went driving for over 2 hours to pick up two devices from two separate second-hand shops in the same day, this thing proved way more valuable than I could have imagined. First off, just look at this thing. This is an incredibly clean-looking device. And it has absolutely solid front controls, even though it once again has an analog stick, so I can't safely say this thing is pocketable. And unfortunately, the shoulder buttons are ridiculously loud, again, just like the R35S. That's probably the biggest downside of this entire device. And clearly the design of this thing was so good that it ended up seeing pretty much being copied one for one by the Battle XP G350, which everyone can only assume is basically just a sub-brand of Anbernic. Like, it has the exact same shoulder buttons, it has the exact same D-pad, the exact same face buttons, the exact same start and select and that. It even has the circles around here. It's like, there's no way you can't say that they're not the same company. There's no way. And just like the other XX devices that I've talked about, this thing has the exact same performance as those. So it can play GTA 3 via Portmaster, and it's kind of crazy like that. But as you see here, I've got this thing running a different operating system. And this was why the 40XXV was as valuable to me as it is, because it gave me a spare device with which to experiment with other OSs. And I'm going to have to turn brightness up on this. Give me a sec. There we go. So I end up using this as my avenue into experimenting with Mustard OS or MUOS, as I mentioned earlier in the video. And good grief, minus a couple of extremely frustrating nitpicks about this operating system, it is absolutely incredible. Like, it boots up so fast. Like, it even beats MinUI by a comfortable margin, and it's got loads of theme options, and you can. It's just an absolutely solid operating system, but it has its problems as well. This thing cannot scrape box art to save its life, and as a result, it's just like every game here, just like I cannot put box art on this. And I've tried using an app like a secondary program that you can install in order to make this thing actually scrape box art, but it barely works, and like sometimes it doesn't even work like at all. And for some box arts, it just like it displays absolutely terribly. Like it just fills up way too much of us. It actually fills up more than the actual screen resolution, which is ridiculous. But by far the biggest problem with MUOS is its configuration of RetroArch, which is absolutely goddamn cursed. As you see here, it's locked to this pixelated front-end design, and you cannot change it from this at all. If you try, you'll brick RetroArch completely, and you'll have to reset all the configuration stuff. Like, at very least, you can reset those configuration files within MUOS itself, but you're locked to this absolutely hideous front end, and you can't do anything about that to change that. Not only that, but there is a ton of pre-configuration for each and every single system. And while people would sometimes like that, if you want to absolutely lock in and dial in your systems to the absolute perfect way that you want it specifically, there is a very good chance that you close it into a game, reload it, and then RetroArch has absolutely completely freaking forgotten everything you've changed, it's a nightmare. But despite this, I can't deny that this is absolutely a marked improvement over every other operating system available for the X6 devices, as MinUI is good, but it is limited in what it's capable of doing, and it also sort of doesn't have box art either. And my CubeXX is running newly, it's also decent, but the startup time on that is not good at all, so it's not ideal for a pocketable device. Like, this is not exactly completely pocketable because, again, we've got this stupid analog stick here that I wish wasn't there. But the slow boot up time of Newly is its biggest problem by far. And the other main important thing about Newly is that technically there are more devices that are planned to be supported for it. At the moment, it's, I believe, almost the entirety of the XX line of Anbernic devices, but only those devices at the moment. There are more things being listed, but we'll get to that in a bit. The Anbernic RG Cube and RG 556, both released 2024. I've lumped these two files together since they are kind of the same device for the most part. They both run the same Unisoc EA20 processor, and primarily the differences between them are that the screen on the RG Cube is the same as the one on the CubeXX. It is a 1:1 aspect ratio 720p screen, whereas the screen on the RG 556 is a 1080p AMOLED screen, which has some weird issues with pulse width modulation, but at least as far as I can tell looking at the camera output on my phone, I'm not seeing anything strange with the video capture on here. But if you are sensitive to that, then just make note of that. Both of these devices were second-hand purchases, and you can probably quite clearly see that just by looking at the bloody colour of the RG Cube that I end up picking up. I do admit that this colour, radiant purple as they call it, it's kind of grown on me, though I honestly do wish I end up finding the black one or the grey and red one. And the reason I prefer these colours is because, well, both of these are second-hand pickups, and when you're relying on second-hand shops like CEX, Cash Converters and the like, to pick up your devices to tinker with them, you have basically no real control over what colours are available at any given time. I mean, you have more options if you're purchasing devices via eBay and the like, but I prefer to pick mine up in person. And originally, my plan was to get the RG 556, but as per the Shop RNG lottery, this thing showed up about 3 weeks before an RG 556. Well, 2 of them end up showing up. And so I end up picking this one up first and tinkering with it for some time, and then end up getting this when it eventually showed up as well. And these would end up being sort of effectively my second foray into setting up Android devices for gaming, and it would be kind of a pain in the arse, certainly more than the Logitech G Cloud, and that is as a result of Anbernic being a bit peculiar with Android builds. I mean, we're seeing that now with the current Android builds in the newly released RG 557 being kind of a mess at the moment, which is unfortunate because I was actually kind of looking forward to picking that one up. The most awkward part about the Anbernic Android builds is this button right here, assuming it'll zoom in, yes, there, the RG button. This thing is hardwired to boot up their dedicated front-end launcher, which is not good at all, especially if you want to actually wire up your own set range of emulators in order to do what you want it to. And so, in order to get this to do anything else, you need to download a couple of apps in order to forcefully remove any mention of the RG front-end from the however it operates and connects to this button and the like, and then you need another program in order to hardwire this button to do something else. In this case, I've used it to load up IG Show. So if I get out of there, I press that, and IG Show loads it back up again. And once I had managed to set this up, just like I did with the G Cloud, I ended up pushing the envelope to see what this thing could actually do. And this thing can do way more than I thought it was capable of doing. Like, it was able to run Zenless Zone Zero at a pretty playable frame rate, all things considered. The only problem, not of course, but the big problem with trying to play that game on the RG Cube is that the cutscenes and certain menus are only designed to display in a widescreen aspect ratio. And as I mentioned, with the CubeXX, this screen is not good for widescreen games. Like, I have not put any PSP games on this thing at all because it just would not be a fun experience. But then I tried testing other games, and one of those was Wuthering Waves. And unfortunately, in the process of doing that, I learned that the Android build of this device, and presumably the RG 556 as well, is technically a rooted operating system. And when I finished downloading WooWah, I booted it up, almost got into the game, and then it came up with an error message saying it detected a root, saw it as a security risk, and then closed down the entire game and wouldn't let me play it at all. And then when I tried to follow a YouTube video in order to get around that, I ended up bricking the device completely. It was a disaster, and the following fallout of that would not be any better. In fact, it would be even worse, as earlier in the video I did mention that there was a period of time where my desktop ended up bricking itself, and well, not bricking itself, but all of the USB ports had failed. That was in the process of trying to download and run the software required in order to reflash a Unisoc TA20 with Android. I did ultimately manage to end up fixing it using my laptop instead, which was, thank God for that. And also how my laptop didn't end up messing itself up in the process, I have no idea. But that was not a fun road in order to rescue this device and effectively save me from having wasted like 130 quid on it. Well, actually, it wasn't 130 quid because this was why I traded in my Retroid Pocket 3 Plus in order to just shave a bit of money off. Whereas with the RG 556, I actually got this technically for free, as I traded in my original launch spec Steam Deck for it. and end up getting like 75 quid in cashback or something out of the other end. And I did that because I already had the Steam Deck OLED by that time. And so I didn't need 2 Steam Decks laying around my house doing nothing. But yeah, as for an actual comparison between the RG Cube and the RG 556, they don't have their own advantages and disadvantages. I mean, this thing easily has by far the biggest amount of systems that I have for any of my handheld devices. It has the SD card on it from the old Steam Deck, so it's 512 gigs. So I've got way much more stuff on this than it has any right to be holding, and it can do a lot of high-end stuff pretty comfortably. And with this this big 1080p screen, it can you can throw pretty much anything, nearly anything at it, and it'll work fine. The chipset is might outdated at this point, but it still handles PS2 pretty well for the most part. But the biggest problem for me with the RG 556, it's not the analog sticks, which are still the infamous Anbernic ones. Like if you're aware of Anbernic devices, then you know that their analog sticks rather, are not the best. But to me, they're fine. But the biggest issue for me with 556 is the shell. The best way I could describe the shell on the RG Cube is like it feels similar to other like contemporary handhelds. Like it's got this like grit, like you can feel it. It's fine. It feels normal, to put it one way. Whereas this has a plastic that is so incredibly slick, it almost feels like you're holding a device that's made out of glass, and that makes it quite uncomfortable to hold for extended periods of time, because as I'm just feeling around the back of it right now, I'm just feeling like bits of dirt just constantly getting stuck onto the plastic, and it feels nasty. And not only that, but this plastic also feels awful when it gets warm. Though admittedly, the only way it's going to get warm is because of your hands warming the whole thing up, because neither this nor the RG Cube really gets hot at all, to the point where you can leave this thing's fan on the auto setting and it'll rarely ever actually kick in, like ever. But the RG Cube has its own advantages. Like, it's much more compact, and because of the fact that the analog sticks are Hall sensor, you can pocket it a bit more comfortably than you can with other handhelds, because Hall sensors analog sticks are known for resisting the damage that regular analog sticks can. Well, most infamously, the Nintendo Switch analog sticks. The problem that those have, this does not have that. And so you don't have to worry too much about you ultimately ending up breaking the sticks by carrying it around in your pocket or anything like that. You just have to play around knowing that the actual analog inputs are not quite there in terms of accuracy. But the form factor of this thing, just like with the CubeXX, it makes it feel way more fun to play than it has any right to be. And this thing also has a gyroscope, unlike the RG 556. At least I'm pretty sure this thing doesn't have a gyroscope, but that means that, assuming you can find the correct emulator to play it, this makes this probably the absolute best way to play WarioWare Twisted on any modern device. And that game has a special place in my heart, because you could not buy that game over here in the UK because of whatever they use to make the motion sensor, I assume. But so as a result of that, I ended up having to import my copy of WarioWare Twisted from the US, and it is by far the best game I have ever played on the GBA, ever. It is so much fun. Like, it's crazy how good that game was. And also how much of a pain it was to try and play it using emulated controls like a D-pad or an analog stick in RetroArch or anything like that. Really, the only problems with the 556 and the RG Cube in present day is that their chipset is a bit outdated for their price point. Like, you now have things like the Retroid Pocket 5 and Flip 2, which are pretty much setting the current standard for handhelds within the near £200 price range. At least I think they're £200 over here. At least it's quoted as being $200 overseas, and I'm not really sure of exchange rates or anything like that. But Yeah, those two devices are setting the standard for devices within this performance bracket, and this is just a bit behind that. And unfortunately, as we're seeing with the RG 557, apparently, that thing is struggling to keep pace with the RP5 as well, as a result of the fact that the GPU is not really as well supported, which is gravely unfortunate because the CPU on the RG 557 is apparently an absolute beast. Like, so much to the point that apparently, from what I've heard, is that it's actually being hamstrung by the operating system. Someone has been able to make that thing CPU run better than what Anbernic says that it's actually capable of doing, which is mad to think about. The Retroid Pocket Classic, released 2025. And now we get to this video's endgame with the Retroid Pocket Classic, and by extension, these two that I mentioned earlier, the Anbernic RG S and the ARC D. If the video title is anything to go by, assuming I've remembered to title it something proper, the ARC is something particularly special to me. So instead of talking about the Pocket Classic, we're actually going to talk about this fella. The ARC is a special device, and it was ultimately the end goal of the project that I set up when I initially picked up the RG35XX Plus, which was what I wanted: a pocketable handheld with no analog sticks, but was also a horizontal handheld device, because as I learned with the 35XX Plus, one of the things that I did not like about it was that it was vertical, and I'm starting to get on, and I'm in my mid-30s at this point, and my hands are starting to get to the point where it's getting awkward to play games, which is not a fun thing to be going through as someone who's been playing games ever since they were like 10 or something like that. But yeah, I wanted something that didn't have analog sticks so that they couldn't get broken off. I wanted it to be horizontal, and after searching for about 30 minutes, 60 minutes on AliExpress to search for devices that could fit that criteria, I kind of learned that there basically isn't anything like that other than the ARC. And so as a result of that, I ordered mine. And when it eventually ended up arriving, I had no idea just how much that I thought I was going to absolutely love this device, because it is by far the most comfortable thing I have ever owned. Period. Like, no other contemporary handheld or anything else I've ever owned can even come close to how good this feels in my hands. Every single shape around the outside of this forms to the hands so well. And even though the back of it is a bit like, it feels a bit like unfinished, maybe is the best word, but either way, it still feels nice, even with that. And so in theory, this would have been my ideal pocket handheld. And I say in theory because unfortunately, the ARC was cursed with having probably the worst operating system situation since, well, the RG350p, to be honest. It was so bad in that regard that there is a very viable option to make that stock OS is the best option for the ARC at the moment. And the reason for that is that apparently at the time of this thing's release, there was some, well, there's some, Anbernic for whatever reason seemed to keep getting themselves embroiled in some random disputes with others. I don't know enough about it to say for sure, but around the time of the ARC's release, I'm aware there was something about them not really releasing the source code or something required in order for other people who make custom operating systems to actually, well, do things with their devices. And so as a result of that, not really many OSs were made for the ARC, like, at all. There were so little, in fact, like, I think there were only 4 operating systems, and only one of them is really what I would call to be viable. And that's what this is running. But going through the other operating systems, we have the Retro Arena, or VRA, which looked to be sort of promising, but at the same time, not only was it buggy and incomplete, I'm pretty sure it's been abandoned at this point. And so I'm not holding out any hope of that's ever going to be completed. You then have Plum OS, which is a clone of Rocknix, which is the other operating system, and honestly, the only viable one that this device can actually use. So I'm just going to boot this up and just have Rocknix here to go through the rest of my thoughts on this operating system in particular. Because in theory, this operating system is actually relatively capable. It's using the same front end that I currently have on the CubeXX. It has a bunch of systems that it's capable of running, and it also has access to Portmaster, if I can find out where it is. So you can, just like with the 40XXV, as well as every other XX device, play Grand Theft Auto on it, which is absolutely freaking hilarious to think about, especially since it has no analog sticks. And at least in theory, I think you could actually potentially play through the whole game with no analog controls. I should actually try and get onto that at some point, maybe. But the biggest problem with Rocknix is that the Anbernic ARC has a function button. It's right here. But unfortunately, this button does absolutely freaking nothing on any other operating system than either stock or the last one that we'll be talking about later on. It does absolutely nothing, and that absolutely kills my desire to use this operating system, because I do not like having to hold the select button and then press A or whichever it is in order to bring up RetroArch, because I am always paranoid that I'm going to hit the wrong button and end up absolutely messing up save states, load states, or whatever like that. It's just a mess. And the worst part about that is that this holding select and pressing another button method of going through RetroArch isn't even consistent across devices. Like, I've seen it where you press this button, but I'm pretty sure on the RG CubeXX it's holding the function button and then pressing the top button. I do not want to have to memorize that for every single device I have to use. It's not fun. The only other operating system available for these devices is known as Gamma OS, and later Gamma OS Core, which was compatible with both devices. And unfortunately, as much as I hoped that Gamma OS Core would solve every single problem that I had with the ARC, it ended up being kind of a huge disappointment in its own regard. One of the big problems with Gamma OS is the startup time, especially on the ARC S. It is painfully long and can easily take upwards of just over a minute to get it to boot into Digiso fully. And obviously, for a pocketable handheld device, that is absolutely unacceptable. And unlike other Android devices that I own, this thing's standby time is absolutely not good, like at all. I initially thought that it wasn't bad when I was first testing it, and thought that losing 15% battery life over the course of 12 hours would be manageable enough. But when you compare it to other devices like the RG Cube, which barely loses like an absolute max of 3% over the course of an entire day, it is night and day different in how bad the battery life is on standby on this. It's especially bad because you'd want to keep it on standby in order to not have to go through the very long boot up time, but you can't really leave it on standby because then you'll come back to the device and find that it's completely run out of electricity, like mine freaking has. And also, although I thought that for the longest time that the function button would do something in Gamma OS, and it actually technically does work, I later learned on that it's just hardwired to the select button, and so all the problems I've had about having to use keep button combinations in order to access RetroArch, that still applies with Gamma OS, which is very, very unfortunate. In addition, while GOS Core is designed to be used with devices that don't have touch screens, I still would not advise using GOSC with devices that don't have touch screens, because navigating it is a huge pain, especially if you're trying to put files onto it. For some time, I didn't realise that the USB-C cable that I was using in order to transfer files over onto other devices was actually damaged, because for most devices it was actually still able to work fine. But for the ARC in particular, the USB-C cable would not hold a proper connection to in order to transfer files via Gamma OS, despite the fact that it says that it's more than possible to do so in the first place. So as a result of that, I ended up having to transfer my ROMs onto the ARC via a USB-C SD card reader that plugs into there and transfer files from there. And trying to navigate the File Explorer menus using just a D-pad and face buttons that you have no idea what any of the buttons does is an absolute nightmare. And it's terrifying when you think that you could potentially just press the wrong button and accidentally delete the files off your SD card instead of what you were actually trying to do in the first place. And the reason that I was having to do that was because, unfortunately, my ARC S is cursed with a broken second SD card slot, which does not have a stable enough connection to actually be usable as a means of storing ROMs. I tried at some point to actually scrape ROMs that were stored on the second SD card, and while it was detecting the ROMs initially on boot up, the scraping process then randomly stopped, and then when I reloaded the games list, everything was missing, so it completely lost connection with the SD card. So I'm having to use this one as just a single SD card device, and as a result of that, you come across a huge issue where the file system used by some of these devices is not compatible with Windows, and so your only means of transferring files onto them is via some other arbitrary program method, either through a program like WinSCP, or if you're very lucky, and in the case of the Gamma OS, you can actually do it through the wireless via Windows Explorer itself, which is fortunate, but it's still not something that you really want to rely on because it is not very fast. But by far the biggest problem with Gamma OS on the ARC is the performance. It is just being hamstrung so badly that it's a tragedy in its own way. It's so bad that it actually makes the TrimUI Smart Pro in power save mode look sprightly in comparison. To give you some idea of just what I mean by the performance deficit between Gamma OS and pretty much anything else, I'm going to put together a little strange demonstration of what I mean by using a combination of game and system that you really don't see on handhelds like these. James Pond 2 on the Commodore Amiga, a desktop computer system from the late 1980s, and something that you have absolutely heard about if you are a follower of Ahoy. It also happens to be an absolute nightmare of a system to try and emulate accurately, even using semi-official means. There is a collection of games and emulator that you can purchase known as Amiga Forever for the desktop, and I wouldn't even recommend getting that because it is not good. Trying to play games on that, the mouse sensitivity is completely off. It is way too sensitive, and there is nothing in the options in order to dial it down to something that is actually even marginally controllable. Your only option is to lower the DPS of your mouse, and you may not even be able to do that depending on what you own. To top it all off, the sound accuracy of trying to emulate through Amiga Forever is also absolutely atrocious. If you have the time, look up a long play of the original Lemmings on the Commodore Amiga and go to the second level. About 10 seconds in, you'll hear the music replace a couple of rather normal sounding tones with an absolutely horrific screech. Really, the only way to get good Amiga emulation, at least as far as I'm concerned, is to play it via RetroArch and the PUAE cores, which somehow, by some miracle, actually seem to work perfectly fine with no setup whatsoever, which is also something you can't say about the dedicated PC emulators, because they have like so many options all over the place that you need to make sure all of them are set up absolutely right, or you'll end up getting an error screen. But anyways, getting back to what I was going to show, here's a demonstration of the game running on the ARC S using ROGNIX. And as you can hear from the audio, there is no lag whatsoever. It is running perfectly fine. See, I've even got a CRT shader going here, and God, I miss this random product placement in video games. It's absolutely mad to think that you used to get away with that kind of crap back in the day. Here's the same game running on the Anbernic RG 40XXV, and again, it's running it almost perfectly fine. I'm hearing slight audio hiccups, admittedly, but it's still running it almost full speed, almost perfectly full speed. And you have to imagine that if I take the CRT shader off, then it's going to have no problems at all. Here it is running on the TrimUI Smart Pro with the power saves option turned on. It is almost at 100% speed again, maybe a bit lower than the 40XXV, but it's still what I would probably consider to be playable enough. You'll notice that I have turned the CRT shaders off this time, because turning them on would absolutely tank the frame rate, but it is right about there. And here it is attempting to run on the ARC D, running Gamma OS Core. Bear in mind that this has twice the amount of RAM of the ARC S. It's almost tragic to think that the performance is struggling this hard on a device that's this powerful. And bear in mind that I don't even know how to set up the Amiga emulators on RetroArch. They are all set to their default levels. So in conclusion, the Anbernic ARC is a line of devices that is blessed with probably the most comfortable handling of any device on the market, and an incredibly versatile 6-button layout that I haven't even gone into detail of just what you're capable of doing with this. And not only that, not only to have the 6 there, but it also still has stacked shoulder buttons, which gives it 10 effective buttons, which is more than pretty much any Windows-based controller that you have access to in present day. But at the same time, the ARC is also a line of devices that cannot reach its full potential with the software that it has available at the moment. And now we get back to where this section was meant to start in the first place, with this new release, the Retroid Pocket Classic. I think it's safe to say that despite the calamity that was Retroid's strange decision to hide a screen much bigger than its bezels inside of a Retroid Pocket Mini and whatever the hell it was that came from that, the Pocket Classic has nearly been universally acclaimed as being one heck of a successful design, and arguably the single best vertical handheld on the market. Like, nothing comes close to like the level of performance that this thing has with its price point. It is just absolutely beautiful in that regard. And this is where I come in to say that despite the fact that this is the most capable 6-button handheld on the market, it might not be the best, quote unquote. At least the potential is there for it to be usurped by the end of 2025. Let me explain, and probably absolutely terribly. Just to start off with, though, I am not underselling what this thing is capable of. It is absolutely an excellent handheld in its own right. It is incredibly pocketable. It's got no analog sticks, as much as people complain that it should have with this level of firepower that it has. It's capable of running Sega Saturn almost perfectly, like the entire catalogue, which is something that even the ARC S running at peak performance cannot hold any claim to at all. It's the fact that it is capable of running Sega Saturn with the amount of firepower that it has, but it comes across that issue with not having analog sticks, because it is powerful enough to actually play some PlayStation 2 and GameCube stuff, systems that actually require analog inputs for a decent majority of their games. But to be honest, it still shouldn't have an analog stick in that case. If you want an idea, but I don't think any handheld like this has done before, do what the Steam controller did and have essentially a circular touchpad with like a concave shape so you can actually feel where the center of it is, and use that as your analog input. Kind of like what the iNeo Pocket DMG did with its touchscreen. Except unlike the iNeo Pocket DMG, do not sell it for $420 freaking at baseline. Like, what the hell is that? But primarily, the main reason why I feel like this thing can be usurped is because of the fact that it is a vertical handheld, and that results in the fact that the controls are definitely cramped. I know it's paying homage to the very original Retroid Pocket 1, which, looking back on it in hindsight, it's an absolutely hilarious looking machine. But as a result of the fact that it is a vertical device, as I said, the controls definitely feel like they are way too condensed. And in lieu of Retro Game Core actually doing his due diligence and actually explaining in proper detail what he meant by the controls being too small, I'm actually going to do a comparison because I have the perfect collection of things to compare button sizes to. So on the left here, we have my Retroid Pocket Classic 6, and I have knocked the camera. So on the left here, we have the Retroid Pocket Classic 6. In the middle, we have the Anbernic RG S. And because I have no more space on the camera, above that, I'm going to put this, which is a Retrobit wireless Sega Saturn controller with analog sticks for some reason. This controller is unironically actually pretty good, despite the fact that for some unfortunate reason, the Z and C buttons are actually wired to the L and R bumpers in Windows. That is such a big miss. And they honestly should have been wired to the stick clicks, which this thing thankfully still has access to. But if it had that, it may as well have been a full 10-button controller, and it would have been absolutely amazing. So, by using the very precise and accurate method of getting a bloody tape measure and laying it across the buttons, I'm going to try and show what the size of the gap across the buttons is. And so, if I'm looking at this, it is about 3.1 to 3.2 centimeters across this gap between the edge of the A button and the other edge of the C button on the Classic 6. If we take a same look at the distance on the ARC S, we get a distance of about 3.9 to 4 centimeters, which is absolutely a huge distance a huge increase in size when compared to the Classic 6. Like, when standing on here, you can see very clearly the size difference. It is not even close. And then on the Retrobit pad, it clocks in at about 4.6 centimeters or so, which is another bump up in size from the ARC, though depending on who you ask, the size of the buttons on the Sega Saturn controller were absolutely freaking huge, even by the standards of the day. And then just to go a bit further, just because I can, we can also measure the gaps between the buttons. Although because of the thing blocking here, I'm going to actually start from 2 centimeters and measure it like this. So for the Classic 6, there's a difference of about 3 millimeters or so, I'd say. If we take a look at the distance between the buttons on the ARC S, it's about 4 millimeters or so. And then if we take a look at the Retrobit pad, it's about the same actually. It's about 4 millimeters again. But what's interesting is that the actual shape of the curve of the ABC buttons is different across all three devices. So although it is laying down, I can say that the Classic 6 has the flattest arrangement of the ABC buttons. And surprisingly, the Retrobit pad is also relatively flat in its curve. And the curve on the ARC S is absolutely by far the most pronounced. What I also like, as a result of getting this pad recently, is that it helped me to immediately realise what the difference between the start and select buttons are on the Classic 6. because this is red and this start button is also red. It's honestly a really nice touch. But what isn't so nice is the rattle difference between all of these devices. To start off, we'll have the classic 6 here, but assuming the camera can actually will be useful enough. Assuming the phone is actually sensitive enough to actually pick that up, but I really shouldn't be saying that because even I can't hear anything. There is no rattle to this device at all, which is absolutely fantastic. If we take a look at the ARC S, then there is definitely some rattle going on with this. Although, funnily enough, even though I can't really test it because it's still trying to charge up a little bugger, the ARC D actually has a bit more rattle than my ARC S, despite the fact that it's the device I got much later. So I'm not really sure what's up with that. But then we have the rattle on the Retroid pad, which is so comically bad. Like, just listen to that. That is absolutely ridiculous. And the absolute majority of that is coming from the D-pad. Like, if you see here, you can see how much you're able to actually twist the D-pad. And this, I'm not sure how it's actually connected to the controller itself, but this one bit is what's causing all of the rattle of this thing. So what I think I've gotten around to saying in the process of all of this is that the Retroid Pocket Classic 6, specifically the 6, is being tempered by its form factor. I say that because the nature of 4-button pads, like the 40XXP here for example, is such that if you are cursed with really big thumbs, you still have a huge amount of space in order for your thumb to fit around without you accidentally knocking any other buttons. But with the Classic 6, this B button is so small and is close enough to the buttons there that even though my thumb is not really big enough for it to be a problem, I can feel the edges of the A and C buttons against the sides of my thumb, and there is definitely the potential for accidentally hitting multiple buttons at the same time. Not to mention that actually pressing a button down like this, you can actually see it with the lighting here that the concave shape inside of these ABC buttons is pretty severe, and there's a relatively sharpish lip on the edge, especially when compared to the other controllers. It is way more subtle. Like there with the controller and with the ARC S, it is much more subtle, the curve on it, and it feels a lot nicer as a result. So trying to press a button like this doesn't really feel that great. So as a result, I've ended up having to end up holding the controller and pressing the buttons like this with a more direct head-on approach, with me pressing a button with the side of my thumb rather than the front of my thumb. And that actually fits in pretty well with the concave shape of the buttons, but to be honest, I'm not really sure how comfortable it'll be to play like this for extended periods of time, especially with how old I am getting at this point. But also, as a fun little fact, while I have the RG40XXV here, it is quite impressive how insanely close these devices are in terms of size. Like, it is barely like 1, maybe 2 millimeters taller at worst. And then if we lay them on the side like this, it's about the same deal. It's like 1 or 2 millimeters wide. And as you see, lining them up like this, it's fascinating to look at them side by side and see the differences between the placements of the screen, how big the bezels are, as well as the sheer height difference between the two sets of controls. Like the D-pad is all the way down here compared to here. But if you move the screens up to be about level with each other, you can see it is a bit closer, but not really as much as I thought it was going to be like. But you can see what I'm trying to just see here. So at the end of all this, what conclusion have I ended up coming to? To be honest, I'm not really sure myself. Picking between the Anbernic ARC and the Retroid Pocket Classic sticks is more difficult than it has any right to be. Both of them are more than capable of blasting through nearly the entire retro game catalogue. Both of them are incredibly pocketable, as much as Rush would want you to say this thing is too big, and their 6-button layout makes them perfect for setting up a whole range of control schemes that no other controller is capable of pulling off. Of the two, the ARC is significantly more comfortable to hold and play for hours and hours and hours on end, but it's held back by its absolutely appalling operating system situation. And not only that, it does suffer from not having enough firepower to play the Sega Saturn games that this control set it would be absolutely perfect for. The Classic 6, on the other hand, isn't left wanting for firepower in this regard, and it's easily the most capable dedicated Sega Saturn handhelds currently available. But its form factor and its rather cramped control scheme doesn't make it suited for playing for longer periods of time, at least in theory. So where does this leave us, or at the very least, where does it leave me, aside from having an incredibly sore throat at this point? As it stands right now, I can't help but say that the Classic 6 is the safer bet amongst this and the ARC line. There's still hope on the horizon for the ARC to be able to redeem itself, but it's coming from only two sources at best. The MUOS team that I mentioned some time back with the RG40XXV has had the ARC D, specifically the ARC D, listed in the planned support list alongside the Game Kiddie or GKD Bubble, which kind of looks like a Game Gear, and the Magic X XU Mini 28. Try saying that 3 times fast. But there's also a separate in-development list, with 2 entries for both the TrimUI Smart Pro, which I still have here, and the TrimUI Brick, which I do not own. That revelation in and of itself makes it seem like MUOS could potentially save the ARC from a history of obscurity. But not only would it absolutely leave out the ARC S if that has not been listed at all, and not only that, but the ARC S is honestly the wiser purchase decision to make compared to the ARC D. But the phrasing of the list gives me the feeling deep down inside that it might be over a year before anything materialises. And in that time, Anbernic themselves have the potential to correct the record, although how they might plan to do that is still up in the air. We've already seen in a leak as early as last October that there was plans for the ARC to be recreated as an XX series device. Now in theory, this would immediately solve the problems of the form factor being cursed with poor operating systems by granting it access to MIUI, MUOS and Newly. But that is acting on the assumption that the 6-button form factor wouldn't cause any problems. But at the same time, that doesn't solve the Sega Saturn problem, as the ARC XX would essentially be in the same performance bracket as, well, the RG40XXV and all the other XX devices, as well as, well, the ARC itself. These two are basically neck and neck in terms of performance. But if there's anything we've learned about Anbernic over the past couple of years, it's that they're seemingly quite adept at adapting to its market environment and to following in the footsteps of the reveals of its competitors. The most standout case of this was the original announcement of the now much maligned Miu Flip, which took so long to manifest itself that Anbernic had already released the RG35XX SP, which came out so much earlier than the Miu Flip that they even had time to do a version 2 refresh which sorted out some wonky face button issues that the original production had. And by the time the Miu Flip eventually came out, it was lambasted for its absolutely atrocious build quality, especially for the fact that the price point was so much more expensive than the 35XX SP that it was competing with. And in the wake of its poor build quality, they released a version 2 with a metal hinge that was so comically bad that it ended up breaking certain colours of the Miu Flip even easier than the plastic hinge that was in the version 1 somehow. And then in another more nebulous case, we have the ZPG A1 Unicorn, which in the time frame between its start and development and eventual release, Anbernic would end up announcing and releasing the original RG Cube, which is a machine that shares the exact same screen and form factor and pretty much the exact same performance level. But whether that was actually intentional or not is very much up in the air, and I can't say for sure, especially as all of those devices were predated by the PocketGo RGB30, which was the very first device to use this 720 by 720 screen. But if there's anything we've learned over the last year, it's that Anbernic are very much capable of putting out a huge variety of devices over the course of a year, and that they aren't afraid to retread the same path if they end up stumbling across something that magically clicks with the audience, like the RG Cube was able to. And now that the consensus on the Pocket Classic has been made clear, the impetus is there for Anbernic to revisit the 6-button handheld, they released all the way back in 2023, and this time to do it right. And unless I've forgotten to bring up anything, I guess that makes this video a wrap. To be honest, I wasn't sure if I was capable of attempting anything like this ever again. The only other time I spoke with a camera in a fashion like this was all the way back in my first year of university in 2009, which was also my very first exposure to the unrestricted internet as a whole. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing back then, and to this day, I feel like it's not changed one bit. I've had absolutely no idea what I've been doing here as well. Life here on the internet moves pretty much at light speed, much faster than I can ever hope to attempt to try and keep up with it. It honestly almost feels like what our parents went through with the advent of computers, and how I've had to constantly help out with anyone's efforts to do even the simplest of things with a computer. In any case, I feel like this is all for now. I don't know if I'll ever get the opportunity to attempt anything like this ever again, but if I do, I hope to see you all then. Until that day comes, this has been, well, me, and I hope you all have a good day ahead of you. As the old man used to say, TTFN. Ta-ta for now. God, I need a drink.